Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 347. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the nationally acclaimed and celebrated poet, playwright, and founder of the Vermont Playwrights Circle, Kim Ward. Kim.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I am doing well.
Yeah.
It is National Poetry Month.
It is National Poetry Month. As of this recording, this is April. This is April 2024 as of this recording. So those that are listening to this or seeing this in the future, if you're watching this in July 2025, know that you're not watching or listening to this during National Poetry Month. You missed out. So, but here it is, April, National Poetry Month. And Kim, you just came out with, well, not yet, but coming out before, as of this recording, it hasn't come out yet. Fire on a Circle.
Yes, it is officially releasing on the 16th of April. And yeah, available where you get your books.
And you that is released through Rootstock Publishing, correct?
Through Rootstock Publishing, yep. And
so talk to us a little bit about how you decided to put together a book of poetry.
Sure. Well, it's kind of like saying, how did you start writing poetry? In that I've been making little books of my poetry in it since I was like 11 by hand. And I certainly have been, doing the routine of trying to get published here and there in smatterings. But I was at a reading last year, actually, and my friends had said there's a big table where you could just put your book out and swap a book. And someone said, Kim, where's your book? And I said, my book? Yeah, where's your book? And I said, I don't have a book. And my friend Linda Quinlan, who's also a local poet, said, Kim, you need a book. And that was that. And so Sam Colbert overheard me, and it sort of was born from there. She is the owner of Rootstock, and she said, Kim, I've always loved your poetry. Talk to me. We got to do a book. And a year later, here it is. Yeah.
Part of the description of this, it talks about how you have the different types of poems. That you have some free verse, you have some monologues, and you also have, what was it, Nordic
sort
verse?
of
What is that?
Nordic forms that I'm trying to imitate with these books about the runes. So yeah, they're in a loosely based Nordic form, which the Eddas would have been on. So all these old stories about Thor and Odin and all those people were done in this little format. And I, have done that with several of my poems that are included from the German Futhark. Anybody who's read Lord of the Rings will see some of the runes that he did, and they come off of those old traditions. And I was also practicing as a pagan at the time, and everybody had their different genre they like to look at, and their different gods and goddesses. And I said, I love the runes in terms of, some people do tarot cards, some people read their future with the runes. And I said, because I'm a poet, I'll do the runes. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you decide what theme of poem that you're writing? How did you decide what form of verse that you're going to put it into? Or did you just kind of let did you let it kind of decide itself?
So it depends on which piece. So there are several pieces in here that come from my master's degree when I was writing a poetic play called Angel on the Fire. And I wanted that to be a mix of poetry and plays. One of my heroes is Ntozake Shange, who created For Color Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And so that was a series of poetic monologues that women spoke. So some of those in here in this collection come from that play, so they're in monologue format. The ones that are in the Nordic form, I deliberately said I'm writing using an ancient rune and trying to match it to my experience in the Green Mountains. I'm going to write these in this Nordic format, and it actually is so much shorter than on the other pieces. And others, depends when you start what you think. What does this theme, lend itself to?
when you put these poems together, because everybody has different ways of how they're inspired by it, did you have an idea about what you wanted to write, or did you have a feeling that you wanted to express in a way, or how did some of
Mhm.
these poems get inspired by for you?
Well, for the Angel and the Fire poems, I was like, I'm in graduate school. I've got to come up with 65 pages of poetry. I did monologues, but also I was like, what do I want to explore for 2 years of my life? What's important to
Right.
me? So those themes came out of wanting to talk about my history, where I came from, the women in my family generationally who had like worked and lived on farms in Vermont, struggled with family members with addiction. That sort of all had its own feel to it. So it's three characters which are loosely based on my grandmother, my mother, and I. So
Okay.
that sort of led into who's talking and why are they talking and how long are these poems. Um, so for that piece it was like that for sure. And for the rune poems, because I was practicing with the runes every day, what does this rune mean? Oh, it means gift, it means contract, what's going on in my life, and meditating on what that means to me in life sort of gave you the feeling of what's the poem going to be about.
Are all your monologues and that you write in the poems, are they always first person, or are there some of them in third person, or how did you
You
decide
know,
that?
the monologues are all, they are, this happened to me, this is, yeah, they're first person, but they're always sort of
Right.
directed at another family member. So
Okay.
like the title poem Angel in the Fire, which starts, I am the girl you brought through the fire, I'm the singing angel in the furnace. That's me talking to my mother about being a premature baby and being like,
Mm,
oh my god, here I was sick as a child, I'm going to tell you about this. So
yeah.
oftentimes that person's talking to an audience, but they're also talking to another family member, so usually first person.
Right. Now, compare this to, say, you've also written some plays before. How close would you say poems are to writing a play as compared to long form prose?
Yeah, I think in some ways, because you have to have that particular voice in a poem, it
Right.
lends itself to a play, right? I got interested in plays and poems through Shakespeare, who did both, right? And
Hmm.
through people who were doing these poems that had that particular voice with something to say. Whereas in prose, you're oftentimes, you've got to figure out what to do with that prose to get it external for a play. Whereas to me, poems are always speaking to someone.
Writing plays has made you a more prolific poet, or being a poet made you a more prolific playwright?
Yeah. I primarily wanted to write plays my whole life, but only wrote poetry. And I got done with my graduate degree and I was burnt out. And I said, I'm going to take a year off. I've been doing this my whole life. Let's write plays. And so being able to go to plays, I had to put poetry down for a while in order to write plays,
Okay.
because I would bring things in and people would be like, we don't need 5 pages about a cricket, right? We need dialogue, Kim. So I actually had to put the poetry aside to write the plays. But I think, it's all going to come together someday before I die in something interesting, because they do inform each other, but I kind of have to put one down to write the other.
Okay. Because of that, do you ended up, when you're writing plays, did you end up by default writing like
Monologues.
monologues?
Yeah, I wrote a 20-minute play that's called Light. And it basically came off of a conversation with a roommate I had at the time. He was male. There were two women in the house. We would leave the light on when we left the house. And he was an environmentalist. Kim, you're wasting energy. You're wasting energy. And I said, John, there's no timer on our light. And where I grew up, and as a woman, coming into a dark house is not safe. And we had this like argument about it. And he finally understood. And I wrote this 20-minute play that is all poetic monologues, because it was the first thing I wrote after I was writing poetry. So yeah, so I had to kind of work myself out of the monologues and say, what are two people saying to each other? Just talk to each other.
What would be your advice to somebody who said, Kim, I want to learn how to write poems.
Mm.
How do I do that? How do I write a
Mm-hmm.
poem?
Oftentimes when people talk to me about wanting to learn to write poetry, I think if you want to learn poetry, read poetry. If you're reading
Hmm.
poetry you like, try imitating that. It's okay, right? We learn to write a sentence by imitating what the teacher's doing. You can start off by imitating other poets you like and write it in your own, use your own theme, but sort of like, oh, if I were going to write a Wallace Stevens poem, I'd write it this way, or a Shakespeare, a sonnet. I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is just write what you feel,
Mm.
and read as much poetry as you can, as widely as you can. And you will find that there's kind of are no rules. There's rules, but there aren't any, right?
Mm.
There's just, it's wide open these days.
Talk to us a little bit about you creating the book Fire on a Circle. How did the process go? Because as you mentioned before, your friends were surprised you didn't even have a book yet.
Yeah.
So, what was part of the learning curve for you to actually decide to get the book published?
Interestingly, I had this manuscript together several years ago in a certain format, and it changed. And I had shared it with another friend who was a poet. We gave each other feedback, and then it kind of sat on the shelf. And so the process for me was maybe a little shorter than it might be for some. But every time I
Okay.
thought I need a collection, I would go, "What's my best poetry?" And then I would look at it and say, wow, these need a theme, or these need to be organized in such a manner that they make sense to the reader. And so that process was the same for sure. And part of it was just like, I'm going to give a manuscript to this editor. Is this thing I've been working on really a manuscript? And then I just had
Mm.
to read it through, like, pretend you never saw these poems before. Do they work? Do they make sense? Do
Mm.
they entice someone in to read them? And format mattered. If you have 50 pages of sonnets, you're probably ready, right? And show them to someone and say, are they strong poems? But then when I gave it to Samantha, she said, what if we break these into these three sections and call them this? And she had a
Okay.
really good eye for, like, I had it organized slightly differently. She said, what if we put this poem here and that poem there? They seem to go together. And we just went back and forth that way until we felt like it was ready.
Can anybody just open up the book and read any random poem, or
Mm.
does it follow a journey, or is there a rhythm that you have to
Mm.
follow as a reader from front to back?
I think you can, for the most part, this book, you could open it anywhere and read a poem, and it would be enjoyable. One of
Hmm.
my big pet peeves about a book of poetry is the cover has to interest me, and I have to be able
Yeah.
to open the first page and read a short poem. Now that's me, right? I want to be in the store and read the first poem and see if I like it. So I that was some consideration. But when you get to the rune poems, they do build, because I wrote the poems based on the first so many runes in a series. And each poem, it says the name of the rune, and then it tells you what it means, and it builds. And toward the end, there's a section where I wrote longer poems that utilize these words, that if you've read the shorter sonnets, you're going to get more meaning out of it in some ways. So
Mm.
um, that section which has the runes, called Green Mountain Runes, it's almost better if you read it in order.
Okay.
but
All right.
but you could, I think, read it in any order. And yeah, so the three sections, the first section, called Pursuit, is really it's love poems. It's how do you pursue life, what is that sort of excitement for life. The second is the Green Mountain Runes, and the last is called Fire, and it's mostly poems about Vermont, and poems from that play that I wrote. So they're
Right.
kind of, you could do it intentionally, but you can read anywhere, I
So,
think.
who would you say is the audience for this book?
The funny thing is, when you write this kind of thing, you don't think about audience, or you wouldn't be able to write it. But I think it's anyone who likes poetry, anyone who wants to introduce themselves to poetry as well, and people who like things with a bit of an edge to them, because everyone who's read them have said, "Oh, there's a bit of an edge there." Ooh, these are not delicate flower poems. There's some gut to them sometimes, and that's kind of what I do. Is That's how I explore hard topics.
Was there any poems that just didn't make the cut that you said, I love this poem a lot, but it's just not right for this book?
There were poems that I just deliberately never put in it because they are funnier. There are more queer poems. They're more out there and more maybe juicy poems that I just left out. But
Right.
there was nothing that I had in there and said, now I got to take it out. By the time I
Okay.
got it collected and said, this will work, I don't think there's anything I pulled that way.
Now that you have this fire, fire on a circle, you're gonna make more volumes of it, like water in a square, or
Water in a
are you gonna
square.
go?
It'll be the Andy Goldberg collection. Make art out of nature. That's an interesting question. I love it. Fire on a circle comes from a line in one of the rune poems, and it's the reason that I chose it because there is this line that says the pursuit is fire on a circle, and to me it's about pagan practice, right? You
Hmm.
cast a circle, you oftentimes have fire or candles, you want to sort of create a world that is sacred, and that's how you do it. And so that's where
Right.
that title came. But I have a feeling that it'll be really interesting to see where I go next because I'm going back to some of my younger roots. Unfortunately, because the world has gotten more difficult again. I'm writing a new poem right now, and the phrase I had sitting around for a month was, "My womb is not a room for you to rearrange."
Mm.
Because living in the US right now, that's how I feel, right? And so, like,
Right.
getting back to feminist poetry and getting sort of cracking open some of those themes will be interesting to see
Right.
what will I collect over the next few years that I might want to put
Right.
in a book.
I know Samantha loves poetry and Rootstock loves poetry, so you already have them together. I mean, you could be able to get another one out next year, even. So.
Yeah, I mean, if I thought I had enough, I don't. I think this book of poetry, some of these poems, the first poem in the book was written when I was a senior in undergraduate school. So I was only
Okay.
20, 19, whatever the heck I was, 20 something. And
Right.
now I'm going to be 58 in May. So that in some ways, yeah, it took a year to put together. And I'll say to my friends, and the book took, how many years to write? Like, 30. So with poetry, it's a slow burn sometimes. But
Right.
you never know. Yeah, you never know. I have a connection with a great publisher right now who they're very keen to work with local authors to also make sure your best work gets out there.
Right.
And that's important, I think. It's because there's the world of the huge publishers who could give two craps about you. There's the vanity publishing, and then there's smaller publishers that are giving you the personal hands-on touch, but also want there to be good quality out there. So
Right. Yeah.
probably not next year, but yeah, yeah, it gives an avenue for sure.
Right. And so Kim, if people want to learn more about you and your work, where's the best place they could go to?
They could go to kimwardvermont.com, and Vermont is spelled
Okay.
out. That's my website.
Okay.
Or they could go to vtplays.com. That's where the Vermont Playwright Circle lives.
That's
Yep.
right. I
That's
found that, the Vermont Playwrights Circle. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Those are the two
Perfect.
places I live when I'm not at work.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Kim, thank you so much for coming on. This has been amazing, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be able to chat about it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what, because now that you have, I'm gonna timestamp this for a second. This is what I love. This is why I like to do this pre-recording and not live. I can always edit
Yeah,
it
you can
later.
edit or yeah.
Yeah, and that way I can make myself sound smarter than I actually am afterwards.
That's right. I know that.
Yeah. um, was there